The Battle of the Bulge marked Hitler's last desperate gamble. With Germany retreating on all fronts and deteriorating conditions at home, Hitler aimed to push the Western Allies out of the war before focusing on the Soviet Union. Similar to 1940, German tanks aimed to breach the Ardennes and seize Antwerp. They amassed over 300,000 troops, 2,100 tanks, and 1,900 artillery pieces against just 80,000 unprepared American soldiers. But it wasn't 1940, and the circumstances were vastly different. Join us today as we dive into the story of the Battle of the Bulge and how American grit halted Hitler's last-ditch strike. When Thomas Krebs enlisted in the United States Army, he dreamed of seeing the world. He never guessed he'd be spending Christmas 1944 in an open field outside a picturesque French village liberated by the Allies just a few months prior. The fresh-faced, wide-eyed 19-year-old American GI had been enjoying the snowy French countryside for just 1 week when his unit received emergency orders reassigning it from the US 9th Army to the 1st Army located to the northeast in Belgium. The date was December 16, 1944. Every minute mattered. Earlier that day, German forces staged a massive surprise attack through the dense Ardennes forest deep into Allied lines. It would be the final German offensive of the entire war, among their largest too, a last-ditch attempt by Hitler to drive a wedge between the Allied armies in Belgium and Luxembourg and seize the port of Antwerp. This logistical lifeline, Hitler fanatically asserts, is the principal supply node fueling the Allied thrust into Germany. Enmeshed in fighting on the Eastern Front, Hitler is convinced that if the Wehrmacht can get to Antwerp and encircle their enemies, the Allies will sue for peace, granting Germany at long last an operational reprieve to close up shop on the Western Front, relocate its forces east, and face the Soviets head-on. Hitler's strategic myopia would ultimately deceive him. He severely underestimated the resilience of the Allied soldiers his men would encounter along the way. Still, on his sole orders over the next 5 weeks, German and Allied soldiers would experience some of the most bitter winter combat of the entire war. Thomas Krebs didn't know it yet, but he was about to be thrown headlong into the icy hell known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Thomas and his company braced themselves against the cold as their convoy bounced, slid, and slogged along 250 miles of muddy roads leading into Belgium. The forward defense area was abuzz with activity when they arrived. It was December 23rd, and for the next 2 days Thomas Krebs spent the night shivering in a barn attached to a local farmhouse, wondering what he was getting himself into. The smell of hot chow on Christmas Eve was a welcome one, served on the side of a bend in the road. The hungry soldiers were eager to enjoy their first real meal in 3 days. They never got the chance. An officer in a jeep rolled into camp, ordering the cooks to put the food away and for the men to gather their belongings. They were moving out. I had no idea of where we were and had no maps to guide us, he recollected. Eventually they found the line of advance, walked for an hour, and were told to turn around. The objective, a local hill, was, they were told, in the opposite direction. Foreboding bursts of artillery and small arms fire echoed in the distance. Thomas's patrol got lost several more times, crossing rushing streams and steep slopes before it arrived at the jump-off point. That very night, multiple patrols went out to establish contact with the onrushing enemy. It didn't take long to find them. Early the next morning, Thomas's platoon regrouped in a tree line, fronting their objective, and set off across a frozen snow-covered field at dawn. As Thomas put it in his own words, as we got about 50 yards out, all hell broke loose, and the Jerries laid down a field of fire with machine guns. Bullets were flying everywhere. I kept moving forward and firing short bursts from my BAR. I kept hitting the ground, firing, getting up again to advance. I passed by several fallen comrades, but could not stop to help because of the hail of fire. I finally reached the tree line, where there was some protection from the trees and brush. I could not visibly locate the enemy as they were pretty well concealed. I looked around to see where the rest of our platoon was and was shocked to see only one other GI who I'd never seen before. We were all alone in this heavily wooded area with machine gun and small arms fire whizzing over our heads. We kept on firing in the direction of their fire until our ammo ran out. The Jerries began to drop mortar shells around us. We got out of there in a hurry. Thomas's experience was to some degree typical of tactical encounters experienced by American soldiers rushed in to restore order during the Battle of the Bulge. Infantry trucked to a jump-off point, trudging through snow and mud until they reached an otherwise unremarkable objective, moving towards said objective, and taking fire from an unseen direction, all the while being too scared to find out where it was coming from, or who was doing the firing. The rest of the battle was something of a blur for Thomas. Escaping to the security of a hidden drawer, he came across a badly injured officer bleeding from wounds in his shoulder and legs. Thomas decided to try and help him reach safety, but as he began dragging his superior through the snow in search of a medic, Thomas's neck was grazed by a machine gun bullet. Miraculously, the bullet missed his arteries, enabling him to continue trying to get the officer out of the danger zone. It took everything in his power to get the wounded officer to a road, and from the road to a medic. Finally arriving at the aid station, Thomas checked himself and the officer into 2 beds, where medics immediately began treating their wounds. To add insult to injury, Krebs found out that his feet were also frostbitten, a common malady indicative of the extremes these soldiers endured during one of the coldest European winters on record. The capture of Krebs' objective was a major victory for his company, preventing further penetration of the German army in its drive to split Allied forces. His unit suffered a 50% casualty rate in the process, a number which included his company commander and several non-commissioned platoon and squad leaders. "After this battle, I was very happy to be alive," he said after the war. "Most people don't understand what it's like to be a soldier in the infantry rifle company. With all the training, I was not prepared for this experience. Nothing can prepare you for the reality of war. Under hellish conditions, it was a life-changing experience, one I will never forget." Today, most of our popular memory of the Battle of the Bulge revolves around images of dark German panzers sweeping through snowy pine forests and hard-nosed American infantrymen shivering in their foxholes, stubbornly resisting with what little arms and ammunition they could muster. These efforts to block key access to the crossroads the Germans needed to reach the coastal port of Antwerp were crucial to the battle's outcome, but they don't tell the whole story. Hitler had 3 armies poised to attack what was then known as the Ghost Front on December 16th. Nearly 500,000 men assembled in secret, along with 4,000 assault guns, tanks, and artillery, most of them members of Hitler's best SS divisions. They would strike one of the most vulnerable sectors of the Allied lines, one held by soldiers like Thomas Krebs, fresh out of basic training at Camp Croft, South Carolina, recent arrivals in Europe, and lacking any form of combat experience whatsoever. Most were members of the 106th Infantry Division and the 14th Cavalry Group, eager to be on the front lines but blissfully unaware of the carnage to come. What made the situation even worse for these American units was how isolated they would be when the enemy attacked at dawn on that freezing December morning. What traditionally had given American divisions an edge at this stage of the war was their material and aerial supremacy. Since D-Day, they had dominated the skies overhead, and despite the quality of German armor and artillery on the ground, deployed such overwhelming quantities of each as to confer on the average infantryman a much greater chance of success. Thick clouds and fog rendered much of this advantage obsolete in the battle's early stages. The Germans took full advantage, advancing under a barrage conducted by the greatest concentration of guns since the Normandy landings. The American lines were inundated with German shellfire, the men bracing themselves as the enemy advanced out of the morning mist. The front-line American defenses collapsed immediately. The center German army group bulged directly into Belgium, headed straight toward the Belgian coastline, while its 2 adjoining armies slowly flared north and southwest. The Germans were hamstrung by challenges of their own. Panzers were formidable, but like all armored units, tied to strings of vulnerable supply trucks trailing behind. Delays transporting fuel to the front, like detours off-road, threatened to freeze the entire assault force in its tracks. In the harsh weather conditions, armored vehicles and mechanized infantry could not stray off paved roads or veer into the countryside to encircle American positions, canalized instead into vital urban choke points they hoped to quickly overwhelm. The most vital of these was Bastogne, held by battle-hardened veterans of the US 28th Infantry Division. None of the American defenders at Bastogne harbored any illusions of matching the Germans punch for punch. The division had been fighting hard for months. They lacked supplies, the weapons, and the support to deliver any knockout blow. They'd have to win this battle on points, absorbing as much damage as they could, and buying their allies enough time to scramble reinforcements to the collapsing front and restore order to the Ardennes. Major General Troy Middleton, the American Corps commander responsible for the defense of Bastogne, devises a defense plan he hopes he can stop the German advance. Patching together groups of infantrymen, half-tracks, artillery, jeeps, mortar, and machine gun teams in a ring around the village, Middleton stakes his men as a tripwire, a sacrificial lamb he knows must stop the Germans from getting to the crossroads beyond and, subsequently, into the vulnerable rear of the Allied lines. Middleton's problem at first wasn't the enemy, but the traffic. Long lines of haggard American soldiers seeking refuge from the chaotic opening salvos of the battle flowed rearward, while Middleton's men pushed forward, clogging the roads with a target-rich environment the Germans capitalized on with a vengeance. Lead tanks from the elite Panzer Lehr division unleashed a barrage of rounds from their 75mm cannons, sending the Americans into panic. 100 vehicles and their occupants were lost. Strangely, the Germans did not press their advantage, opting to hold a line around the village while mobile units learned more about the positions of the American defenders. Rumors of an American armored division in the area momentarily held up the German assault, prompting the 2 German armored divisions and accompanying infantry to methodically encircle the town. As the 2 sides wrestled for control of the village's outskirts, they frequently came into contact with each other, amplifying the degree of unpredictability draped over the whole affair. Allied leaders scrambled to identify suitable units to reinforce Middleton's beleaguered garrison. They find the American 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, of Band of Brothers fame, in reserve, paratroopers with elite pedigree, battle experience, and enough mobility to get them into the fight immediately. The 101st had been preparing to transfer to the Pacific, when suddenly ordered to proceed to Belgium at 4 a.m. Without crew-serve weapons, winter clothing, or rifles, most of them were stunned. Loaded onto open trucks like cattle, the airborne soldiers were driven to the front under a dreary sheet of cold rain. Thrown into a situation more reminiscent of a stagnant medieval siege than the lightning maneuver warfare they were trained for, the paratroopers would lack almost every form of armor, artillery, and anti-tank vehicles most units would employ against elite panzer divisions. They would fight using only the gear they could strip from dazed Americans marching past them in retreat, and anything else they could carry into Bastogne on their backs. They arrived in Bastogne mere hours before the Germans attacked. The German hesitation has cost them an easy victory. Scrambling forward to meet the thrust, the paratroopers frantically dug in. Lieutenant Frank Gregg, a member of the 101st Airborne Division present in Bastogne, remembers his simple orders to get up this road here, run into the Germans, and stop them. They were attacking with divisions, the Germans were, he said in a post-war interview. I had one rifle company with about 100 men. The fighting conditions were about as suboptimal as it got during World War II, though perhaps not as bad as being stuck in a rainy jungle dugout in the Pacific or frozen solid for long stretches on the Eastern Front. Fighting from a foxhole in Bastogne nevertheless meant enduring cold, filthy, and inhospitable conditions. Underground shelters were prone to fill with water. Soldiers under observation could not get out to relieve themselves. There were never enough wool blankets to stay warm. You had to cook, eat, and sleep right where you were, living under the omnipresent fear of death. According to one paratrooper, the ground was so frozen it was absolutely impossible to dig a foxhole with any type of tool that we had. Instead, they took TNT and detonated them on the ground. The resulting holes were such that instead of having 1 or 2 persons in a foxhole, they blasted out so much dirt that we could fit 6 or 8 people in the resulting crater. Temperatures hovered at 15 below zero. Snow fell overnight to one's knees. Food was sparse. The paratroopers' leather boots were not winter-rated and became soaked in a matter of hours. Trench foot was common, as was frostbite and hypothermia. Few had overboots. Few had warm smocks as the Germans did. Medical supplies and qualified medical staff were nowhere to be found. While the paratroopers fought to defend Bastogne, the Allied High Command held a conference to discuss the best course to lift the siege. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Allied Supreme Commander in Europe, had 2 options at his disposal: Montgomery's British forces to the north and Patton's Third Army to the south. He asked both who could get there faster. When Montgomery claimed he could pivot his army in 2 short weeks, a quick turnaround for a force that size, Patton retorted that he could shift the axis of attack in 2 days. A stunning claim. Patton, a swaggering cavalryman known for his bombast and self-assurance, reassured an incredulous Eisenhower he was dead serious. "Do it," he was told in reply, and so he got to work. Patton held up his end of the bargain, shifting his force northward in record time, but it would be several weeks before his relief column could break through the solitary road leading to Bastogne. The defense at the crossroads continued into the new year. When offered the chance to surrender by his Prussian counterpart, the commanding general of the 101st Airborne Division issued his famous reply: "Nuts." The coming weeks would be hell for the paratroopers, with night attacks by German fighter bombers and long artillery barrages causing widespread damage to the town. On a larger scale, these would do little to move the needle. Fuming from his command bunker, Hitler watched as his over-optimistic timetables fell into disarray. Rather than allow his central army to circumvent the town on a parallel road and drive to his original objective, Hitler became obsessed with Bastogne, the thorn in the Bulge's side. Elsewhere, his panzer armies had better luck. The 5th Panzer Army, which had bypassed Bastogne's northern flank to screen the center thrust against Montgomery's Anglo-American divisions, made it to within 4 miles of the Meuse River by Christmas Eve, halted only by gasoline shortages and worsening weather. Montgomery had cleverly swung his reserves southward to prevent any crossing of the Meuse, securing the northern flank from being wedged open altogether. Patton's 3rd Army finally broke through to Bastogne on Boxing Day, December 26th, relieving the encircled paratroopers and driving further forward to regain lost territory. On January 3rd, the US 1st Army began the first of several counterattacks, which slowly concentrated Allied power onto the flanks of the German wedge, suffocating and containing the assault. It helped that by the new year, meteorological conditions had improved, enabling Allied fighters to conduct low-level close air support missions for the first time. Unleashing the offensive might of Allied combined arms doctrine, many German columns were frozen into position. A senior German officer later recalled how the air was so thick with Allied jabos, slang for American P-47 fighter bombers, that our tactical units could not move during the daylight hours. With not enough fuel to run our ambulances, the spearheads of the 2nd Panzer and Panzer Lehr divisions are wiped out. Further north, waves of British bombers fly unopposed over the German-held town of Saint-Vith, devastating the town with 100,000 tons of incendiary and high-explosive bombs. The Germans take 3 days to clear the town of debris and wreckage, a period when many relief vehicles fall prey to the predatory instincts of low-flying Allied fighters. The town, like Bastogne, is a critical pillar of the German attack. When it's overwhelmed, the Germans have little recourse but to retreat. In a furious last-ditch attempt to jumpstart his offensive, Hitler greenlights a massive aerial assault conducted by 1,035 Luftwaffe aircraft on Allied bases throughout Western Europe. He hopes to capitalize on the good weather, wrest control of the skies over the Ardennes, and give his forces a reprieve from Allied air attacks. Codenamed Bodenplatte, the air operation commenced in tandem with Operation Nordwind, an 11th-hour diversionary thrust to the south through Alsace-Lorraine, calculated to relieve pressure on the Bulge and unjam the advance on Antwerp. Bodenplatte was executed by inexperienced pilots operating in complete radio silence over German, Dutch, and Belgian territory. The raid immediately came unhinged when German air units came under heavy flak fire before they'd even left Germany. Operational security had been so tight, Göring hadn't remembered to inform the Reich's trigger-happy anti-aircraft gunners his units would be flying overhead. By this stage of the war, such a sight was unfamiliar indeed. 16 Luftwaffe aircraft are downed by their own units before they even reach the front lines. The attack was reasonably successful, destroying dozens of RAF and American fighters bunched up on airfields across the Low Countries. On the return home, many of the German pilots are ripped to pieces by pursuing Anglo-American fighter aircraft and accurate Allied flak. Luftwaffe gains, all told, were marginal and hollow, emblematic of the battle as a whole for the German High Command. By mid-January, the Battle of the Bulge was over. Heroism displayed by the paratroopers at Bastogne, the pluck of fresh-faced infantrymen rushed into the breach, and the steadying presence of Allied reinforcements turned the German offensive on its head in short order. It was a propaganda coup for the Allies. For the Axis, it only forestalled the inevitable, upsetting but far from thwarting Allied preparations for their inevitable entrance into Germany itself. The Bulge offensive may have bought a few weeks for Hitler, but it was a fatal decision. For 75,000 casualties suffered by the Allies, the Germans suffered 120,000 men and countless materiel lost or destroyed, something they could ill afford to replace. In the final reckoning for the Wehrmacht, the elusive allure of a lightning victory on the Western Front unhinged Germany's ultimate hopes of wartime survival. In a few short months, the walls of Hitler's Reich would come crumbling down. What other interesting historical battles would you like us to talk about next? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.